Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending. This is our first solo webinar. We've done some with some of our partners. First one that our team has put together just for us to walk through. This is a topic that comes up a lot. So we get a lot of questions about email, and as a marketing agency and a technology company, this is something that we spend a ton of time with. So really we spent the past month or so combining our 20 plus years of experience with email. And we put together what we think is going to be a really powerful and helpful guide on email marketing. There's a lot of material to cover, so we want to make sure to get it all in within the hour, but we will be sharing the video after. So anything that you miss or anything you want to go back to, we will be sharing the video after. There'll also be a short survey that we're going to send out after. We'd love your feedback because we'd like to continue to do these, as well as make sure that we really hit the mark here with this webinar in particular. And always welcome feedback. So want to make sure that we get feedback on how we did today. But response was overwhelming. We set out to host a smallish webinar, and really this turned into something much larger, which was great. And we're really excited to be here today, both myself and the team. So the title, The Inbox and Beyond, that really kind of came from, how do we get emails to someone's inbox, and then how does that essentially work through the organization? How does that generate ROI? How does that help us to use email as a marketing tool? A lot of opinions on if email still works or not, but what we see is email is still really one of the most powerful ways to reach your audience. So again, The Inbox and Beyond was the title we came up with, and then the theme came out of every time I said the title of the webinar. The theme came from I just heard Buzz Lightyear. His voice reading the title of this. So while we don't have Buzz Lightyear reading the title for today's webinar, I just heard The Inbox and Beyond every time I said it. So that's where the space theme came from, and it seemed pretty fitting. So again, thank you guys for coming and being here, and hopefully you find this to be helpful and really useful in your own email marketing efforts. So just to kind of go through what we're going to cover today, we'll do a little background and bios, myself and Cassie, who's going to be helping today. There are a few other people from our team on as well, so we'll do some little bit of bio and background there. We'll talk about what is email marketing, just to set the landscape for what actually is considered email marketing. Talk about some of the legal concerns. So obviously we know about spam and compliance, so we will talk about that. We'll touch upon domain and IP reputation. So how to make sure that we're delivering to the inbox and that we're not being blacklisted. We'll talk about increasing your email database and ways to do that, as well as the anatomy of a perfect email, some deliverability tips, and then some technology that our team uses, including email providers. So when we use the term ESP today, that's going to be referring to email service provider. So those are your MailChimps, your Constant Contacts, your HubSpots, your Pardots of the world. So we'll use the term ESP, but really those are just your email providers. So there's a brief outline of what we'll cover. And what we'll do is we will pause as we're going through. Please use the chat for any questions. So there's a lot of people on, so we don't obviously want to unmute, and that would get confusing. But we do have someone monitoring the chat. So Mike Casali from our team, who's been with us since we started, Mike will be on and monitoring the chat the whole time, and then he'll ask the questions within the appropriate and relevant section. So again, use the chat on the webinar today. Feel free to ask questions. If we don't get to all the questions that come up, we'll make sure to address them after the fact. But again, please feel free to use the chat, and we will be monitoring that as we go through. And one other thing to point out, you may notice in the bottom of your screen, there is a closed caption button. We did enable live transcriptions and captioning for this webinar. So for anyone that needs any visual assistance as we're going through the audio, there is a closed captioning button, again, in the bottom toolbar that you can turn on the captioning on your end. It's the service called Rev. So again, for anyone that needs that, that's where to access it. And we will follow up after this with, again, the short survey, the gift cards for coffee. We want to buy you guys coffee, and then the webinar recording, as well as an email marketing checklist. So without further ado, just quick background on IMG. We're a digital marketing agency We do a lot of email marketing, social marketing, pay-per-click, web development, and then there's a whole side of our business that does marketing technology implementation. So we work a lot with tools like Salesforce and HubSpot, primarily Salesforce and Pardot, but we do have experience with other platforms. So helping clients implement technology for marketing purposes, as well as delivering marketing content through email, social, and web channels. So my background, about 20 plus years now in this space. When I first started with email marketing or accessing email, and not to necessarily date myself, but we had the Gopher email system. It was like a black screen with green letters on it. It was very DOS-based email system. And I just remember it was called the Gopher email system. So really have been working within email for a good 20 plus years now. And I've always found that, even as deliverability has changed and as the landscape of marketing has changed, I've always seen email as one of the best ways to reach people. And again, there are regulations around sending email, and there's definitely things to be aware of. But personally, I've always felt like email was the best way to reach people as the landscape of marketing technology has grown. I really just found email to always be effective. So there are schools of thought that it's not as effective anymore. I just think the landscape is changing with all marketing, and to me, email is still as effective. And with the coffee theme, right now I have today it's my Starbucks coffee, but definitely mix it up between Starbucks and Dunkin', whatever I have time to run out for in the morning. So without further ado, I'll let Cassie introduce herself, and then we'll dive right in.
Perfect. Thanks, Gil. So I'm Cassie Remillard. I'm the Director of Marketing Strategy here at IMG. I've been in the digital marketing space for about 5 years now and have really fallen in love with email. I enjoy everything about it. And I think my specialty lies in the nurture campaigns for email. So I work with a very large variety of clients here at IMG. So I have a lot of experience writing copy in many different industries. So I really enjoy that. And as Gil said, email is a very powerful tool. There's 217 people on with us today, and we gathered about 90% of you guys with email. So it definitely works.
Awesome. Thanks, Cassie. And just two other quick intros. Mike Casale, and Mike we'll talk throughout as questions come up, but Mike Casale is on as well. He'll be monitoring the chat. And then a quick shout out to Kristen Darcy, who designed everything that you see today, the webinar, all the graphics, the social content that went out, the emails that went out. Kristen's our resident design rock star, and fortunately she enjoyed putting all this together because we probably drove her crazy with all of our changes. So thank you, Kristen, and thanks for being on as well. All right, so let's just start with what is email marketing. So email marketing in a nutshell is sending commercial messages to a large audience, right? So it's not the one-to-one emails that we send on a daily basis. Email marketing is mass communication through email, essentially to solicit business. So when we talk about what the objectives are, the goal of email marketing is usually to either build brand awareness or sell a product or service. So in one scenario, we want to allow people to understand who we are and what we do. We want them to know our business, and we want to build that brand presence, which is very important. We want to share content, right? So after this webinar, we're going to send emails out that just really link to content that came from the webinar. So we want to build some brand authority and some subject matter expertise, but ultimately we want to increase revenue. So most scenarios, email is about generating sales qualified leads and generating revenue for our business. So why is email marketing? And I alluded to the fact that I believe that email is still a very powerful channel, and not to read through all the stats, but ROI of email, $42 for every dollar spent is, and there's studies that show some varying numbers here, but consistently we're seeing between, high 30s to low 40s in the ROI of every dollar spent on email marketing. Those dollars spent could be on the software that you're licensing to send the emails. It could be on list acquisition. It could be on, generating some of those email addresses we need, but the ROI of email is higher than most channels at this point. And 21% of emails are open within the first hour. There's an immediate response. People enjoy reading promotional emails, and ultimately emails are more likely to drive sales than social in most cases. Now, that's not for all businesses, but we find that social is a great branding tool. Email tends to drive more revenue because it's really it's that direct conversation with your clients one-to-one. And we'll talk about personalization and how that will work. but ultimately email should be driving higher results than other channels, especially social. So we'll talk about the types of emails you can send. So essentially we look at the types of emails in 4 buckets. So you have your operational emails, which typically do not require an opt-out or any type of notification for people to asking them to stop receiving those emails. Operational emails are things like a terms of service that has to go to all your clients, or I think of like an onboarding sequence. So when a client signs on with us, we have some emails that go out automatically that are operational. It just lets them know next steps, who they're going to work with, some terms of service and things like that. Those emails, again, they kind of fall into the email marketing bucket because they're automated and in some cases are sent out in bulk, but they do not need anything related to like an opt-out or a preference center because they're purely operational and not meant for solicitation. Those emails tend to be less visual and again, more one-to-one. You have transactional emails. Transactional emails, again, they look a little more one-to-one typically, not overly graphic, but transactional emails are more when somebody purchases something from an e-commerce store, for example. So you go online, you buy from an e-commerce site and you get an email back notifying you of that transaction. Those emails, again, they're automated, they're email marketing, but that would fall into the transactional email bucket. And the next two here are the ones that most of us are more familiar with in terms of what we're sending currently if we're using email marketing. So batch and blast. So batch and blast are your typical MailChimp or constant contact emails. They're visual. They go to usually one large audience. So we just take all of our mailable prospects and send them to everybody. They're usually not super personalized, but they look really nice. They build a lot of brand awareness and they drive people to our website or other social channels. So again, the batch and blast emails, more visual, tend to have slightly lower open rates, but higher click rates than a nurture campaign or more of the personal emails, which we'll talk about. But again, batch and blast are what most of you are probably familiar with in terms of email sending and the platforms that you're using now. And then nurture campaigns are typically more one-to-one. So you may have seen some of the emails that were sent out. There was one that was very visual, right? It was the invitation. And then there were some emails that looked like they were coming directly from me. Your name was merged in those emails. My signature was at the bottom. So for all intents and purposes, it looked like a personal email that I just opened my Gmail to send. However, they were sent automatically through email marketing software. The open rates were considerably higher in those emails than the batch and blast emails we sent out. The response rate was also considerably higher. So what we saw was that on a batch and blast email where we'd see a 20% or so open rate and very few responses, that open rate on the nurture campaigns or those more individual looking emails, the open rates were over 30%, so about a 10% uptick. And it's because they look very natural. So again, these are the 4 main categories, but for this conversation, we're going to focus mostly on batch and blast and nurture. And here's just an example. So on the left, this was the save the date. This is, again, what we'd consider batch and blast, more visual. And on the right was more of that personal email that looked like it was coming from me and going directly to an individual with their name merged in it. We still do need the opt-out. So, we put update email preferences here. We'll talk about why that's required. But again, these are the differences between the 2 emails. So I mentioned the opt-out. So when we think of sending these emails, we really have to focus on, are we supposed to send emails to our audience, right? So did they opt in, and what are the legalities around spam and compliance around spam? So technically spam is sending a commercial message, an email marketing message to a large number of recipients that didn't ask us for that information. Now, a lot of us say, well, that's really hard because we have a large database and we didn't specifically ask everybody if they want to receive emails from us. Technically, by legal definition, it is spamming whenever you send those mass messages. So the marketer's definition of spam is a little bit different than the legal definition. The marketer's definition is we just try really hard not to annoy people because we don't want to get flagged as a spammer from our email service provider, right? So at the end of the day, as long as we're careful in how we're sending those emails, there's a good chance that we're not going to violate any laws, which again, we'll talk more specifically about. Because in essence, if we're only working with people that have specifically said to email them, it is a lot harder to get the message out. So that is a challenge that a lot of our clients and a lot of people we talk to would face. So there are two laws around this. There's CAN-SPAM compliance and then GDPR. CAN-SPAM compliance is the old, US-based compliance law that's been around for quite some time. GDPR is a newer legal regulation that rolled out in the EU. And I'll talk a little bit about both just to understand the difference. CAN-SPAM is much looser in terms of how they track that. So a couple things to touch on. You don't want to use false or misleading, from name or the who it's being sent to or the reply to. You want to send an email from you to the person you're emailing and not mask any of that information. You'll see sometimes if somebody's email spoofing, you might see someone else's name that is someone in your team even, and it looks like the email is going to someone that's not even you. Those are things that obviously you want to avoid and help you not get flagged as a spammer. So the header information, the from, the to, the reply to, you want to make sure that's all valid. Don't use deceptive subject lines. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but we think of like clickbait, right? There's a lot of clickbait online. We click on headlines because we think it's one thing and it's not. So you want to be careful with using deceptive subject lines. We want to make sure people know that, there is some ad purpose, right? There's some marketing purpose to what we're sending them. So it can look conversational, but at the end of the day, we want them to know that this is in some sense a solicitation. We want to make sure our address is on the email. So where are we located? We want people to know that we're, local or regional companies. So we want the address to show. We want people to know how they can opt out. This is required. So any email platform that you're sending from, if it's an email marketing platform, you do need to make sure that you have a way for them to opt out or update their preferences. And you want to make sure to honor those requests promptly. So if it's automated, that you don't have to do anything. But in some cases, if it's manual, you just want to make sure to honor those requests. So in terms of CAN-SPAM, again, there's a lot of gray area here, but you can get around most CAN-SPAM issues without having much of an issue. In all the years we're working in email marketing, we've never seen an issue with someone violating CAN-SPAM because as long as you're not being misleading, it's pretty easy to get through the legalities of CAN-SPAM compliance. GDPR is different. GDPR, again, this is the EU's version of CAN-SPAM essentially, but it's a much more robust and detailed regulation. And GDPR actually, it doesn't just take into account email. It's any information you're collecting on your website, through text, through email, through anything else. So essentially, anywhere you're gathering information from people, you're storing cookie information, you're tracking anything about them. If you did not specifically get their permission to do that, you're violating GDPR. So GDPR only applies to businesses who have EU email addresses in their database. So if you're emailing local or regional US-based clients or prospects, you don't have to worry about GDPR regulations. If you're emailing people that are overseas, specifically the EU, you need to make sure that you're asking for permission. So rather than send emails to people and send them to your website and then find out if they want to opt in, you actually have to go with the opt-in mentality first. Do you want to receive my emails? Are you okay with me adding a cookie to your browser when you visit my website? You need to get that permission first, and then you can market to those people. So again, this is much more specific. If you are sending emails or tracking web activity, again, to those in EU, then there could potentially be a legal issue. Now, we haven't seen this happen, but it is something to be aware of because GDPR, especially if you're marketing overseas, is a much bigger deal than CAN-SPAM compliance. All right, I will pause here. Mike, any questions in the chat yet?
Yeah, Gil, we have a couple questions so far. First question was, can you just talk about the difference between open rate and click rate a little bit more?
We will get to that. Actually, Cassie's going to answer that exact question.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. And that's all the questions we have so far.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Thanks, Mike. All right. So let's talk about reputation. So we want to dive into how do you check your IP reputation? So a lot of times people are sending emails and say, well, I don't know if they're getting through, or are they getting through, or is my domain blacklisted? Is my IP address blacklisted? Is there an issue with the IP address I'm given by my email provider? So this will actually address that. So there's 4 tools on here. And again, we're going to share these slides or the recording. The one I like the most is MX Toolbox. And the other one I like a lot is senderscore.org. And what you do is you put in your domain name or your IP address, and it will actually show you if you're blacklisted on any servers. So, and here's an example. So this is MX Toolbox. I type in my domain, I click on blacklist check, and then you'll see here, it gives me an okay next to all the blacklists that are available. There's over 100 of them. And if we were blacklisted, it would give us a reason and there'd be a link. What you can do is if you ever get blacklisted, you can go to the blacklist that you're on and you can request removal. So I always tell people, if you haven't checked to see if you're on a blacklist, it's important to check. If you do show up on any blacklist, don't panic. All you have to do is contact that blacklist. There's usually clear instructions on how to ask for removal. And in most cases, you can be removed from those blacklists. But it is important to check, because as you're starting to try to decipher, where your deliverability issues may be, you want to make sure that this isn't one of the issues. And again, just using a tool like MX Toolbox or Senderscore will help you with that. So really important tool, really quick and easy. But I highly suggest, looking at these 4 tools I've listed here, just to make sure that you have a good sense of, if there's any issues with your domain or the domain that you're sending from. As far as I just saw, not that I'm monitoring chat, but I just saw it pop up. So your IP address, that would actually, usually you can put in your domain name, but the IP address would be the IP of the email server you're sending from. You can usually get that from your email provider. So I know we work with Pardot a lot, and there's an IP address listed in the Pardot account. So we would just copy and paste that IP, but it's not usually your personal IP because you're not sending the email through your email account. You're usually sending it through a third party. So the IP you typically would want to check is the IP of the third party system.
Yeah, we just had another question come through. How quickly can you be blacklisted again after removal, and how often should you monitor this?
It's a good question. I typically monitor it after any big send. So if I'm sending in small batches, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, I don't worry about this. The numbers are too small in order to really feel like there's a chance of getting blacklisted. You're only going to get blacklisted if there's multiple complaints directly to the email provider, which doesn't happen a lot. So the odds of getting blacklisted if you're sending less than 5 or 10,000 emails on a consistent basis is very low. If you're sending, we sent out about 25,000 emails for this webinar. So we'll check, not now, but in about a week, we'll check to make sure that nothing went wrong. But I typically, even if you check once a month, if you're sending a lot of emails, I think that's fine, or shortly after a big send.
One more question here, Gil. Do you know if IP on Pardot can be changed?
So technically, yes. Any email service provider has multiple IP addresses that they'll send from. If the IP was damaged, there is a way to request to move to a different IP, but you'd have to show the email provider, whichever provider it is, that there is an issue with the IP address. So most of the time they should be aware of it already. If they're not, you could bring the report to them and say, look, this is the IP that I'm on your servers. There's a blacklist showing, that's your job to take care of, not mine, right, as the customer. So that is something that can be requested if it shows up on a blacklist. And then when we talk about IP, this leads us to this next topic here. So as far as IP goes, most of us are sending from a shared IP. So a shared IP means you're using the same IP address as lots of other people sending email. Usually that's okay, and it's a good thing because their good deliverability, the fact that others are sending emails that are getting delivered helps you. Now, the opposite could be true. If there's some spammers on the same IP as you, that could actually hurt you. But if you go with the dedicated IP, it takes so much work for you to warm up that IP for your use that your deliverability is actually going to be much lower on a dedicated IP for a while, because that IP has no reputation with the email system. So Google, Gmail, Microsoft, any of the other email providers, they don't know your IP address is good. They don't know anything about you. So there's a whole process of warming up that IP that takes a while. And you have to build up your own reputation, which again could take many, many months if we even ever get there. Whereas with a shared IP, you're relying on the email providers to have done a really good job in keeping, high deliverability, which when we talk about the ESPs, I'll share why not going with the cheapest one is always the best. Going with the MailChimp, a Constant Contact, part out of HubSpot, those tools have such high deliverability that a shared IP generally is your best option. And in 99 times out of 100, that's the way to go. A dedicated IP is typically only good for very high volume senders, and that's usually at the 250,000 emails and up a month. If you're sending 10,000, 20,000, even 50,000 a month, a dedicated IP would be, not only would it be expensive in most cases, but the time it would take you to warm up that IP just wouldn't be worth it. So shared IP is good. You just want to make sure that the IP you're on is from an email provider that has great deliverability and that the specific IP you're on doesn't have any outstanding issues.
Okay, Gail, one more question here, if you don't mind, please.
Yeah.
What is the dedicated difference between in timeline to warm up a shared IP versus a dedicated IP?
Awesome question. So shared IP generally doesn't need to really be warmed up. Sometimes we'll send in small batches at first just to make sure that we're not having any deliverability issues. So for example, if we were sending to 10,000 people and we wanted to send our first email out, maybe I'll break that up into 2 or 3 smaller lists just to make sure everything goes off as expected. But in theory, there's not a need to warm up a shared IP. A static IP could take several months to warm up, and you have to send this in a specific order. So a static IP has a very specific warm-up process. And most of the time, your email service provider will provide guidelines on what that should be. But in some cases, it's 10,000 a day for 5 days, then 20,000 a day for 5 days, then 30,000 a day for 5 days. But you're not sending all 30,000 at a time. You're sending in 3 batches of 10,000. So there's a very specific plan for a static IP warm-up or a dedicated IP warm-up that has to be followed. And I usually recommend talking to your email provider about that to make sure that it aligns with their best practice. But with the shared IP, you usually don't have to do much at all. And maybe, again, you break it up into a few smaller lists to make sure that it looks good, but usually not a worry. All right, so we talked about spam and how to make sure that we're not being flagged as a spammer. We talked about IP reputation. And then we talked about shared versus static IP addresses. So we're going to dive into data. So this is really important. You want to understand how is the data that's in your database. So a lot of times, again, we see this all the time. People start off with a list of 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 people they've never emailed before. It's just data they've collected over the years. So you first want to look at how you collected that data. Were they website signups? Was that at an event? Did you purchase a list? Are they existing customers? Did you run ad campaigns? So you want to have a good sense of how that data was collected. Things like website signups, events, and existing customers, we would expect high deliverability, and we shouldn't have to worry much about the validity of that data. And I wouldn't worry too much about bounce rates and spam complaints with that type of data. With the purchase list, though, that's where you want to be careful. Now, there's a lot of different schools of thought here. I believe that purchase lists can be a good thing. There is no email provider or no top tier email provider that will tell you it is okay to send to a purchase list. They will all specifically tell you that it's not allowed. And if they catch you doing it, they'll block you. Everybody does it. But if you read through the fine print, every email provider will tell you cannot use purchase lists. So how do you use a purchase list and not get caught? You just want to make sure that the list you're using is from a reputable source, and that the data is actually clean, that you're not getting a lot of bounces, and that you're very careful in how you're emailing those people, and maybe do it in small batches. So again, I'm a huge fan of looking at, getting data from other sources, but you just want to be careful where you get it from and how frequently and how you send to those people. The catch with all of this is if your data is not clean, meaning high bounces, lots of unsubscribed, spam complaints, you could get banned from the email provider you're on. So they may shut off your account, which you'd say, okay, well, I can just go somewhere else and take my data elsewhere, which is true. But even worse, your domain could get blacklisted. And depending on how bad that is, that could take a while to clean up. We've seen situations where clients, bought hundreds of thousands of email addresses from some unknown source. It was like down a back alley from a trench coat, want to buy an email list, and they sent to hundreds of thousands of people, and it creates such a ripple effect and really damaged their domain. In a few cases, clients had to get a new domain just because of that. So that won't happen with 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 email addresses, but you just want to be careful to make sure that all your data is clean, because a bounce rate greater than 10%, is going to raise some red flags. And the more consistently that happens, the more likely you are to get, in trouble with your email provider. And just to kind of touch on that, we do have some services we use to do some light validation on the data. So we use NeverBounce. That's my favorite. We don't, none of the tools we're talking about today, we have, we endorse in any specific way, but NeverBounce is the one we use internally. And what it allows us to do is upload a list. And then you'll see there on the lower right, those are the types of results we get. So it'll say valid, unverified or unknown, and invalid. The invalids we take out right away. We just don't send to those. The valids, we know there's about a 90% chance they're good. So it doesn't know 100% that they're good, but it knows usually within a 10% range of if they're good or not. So I like to think my valids will be a 90% deliverability. And then my unverified or my unknown average is 70 to 80% deliverable. So a little lower than what we want. So what we like to do is mix some of the unknowns in with the ones that are good and send them in batches so that we kind of average out our, the send. So if we know we have 1,000 people that it's going to get to, but we have 500 people we're not sure about, when we send that email, the average for that email send will be high enough that the email provider won't necessarily see it as a red flag. So we do like to balance the list out if we are validating results. So again, I recommend using a tool like NeverBounce. It's very inexpensive. It's pennies per send or pennies per validation. So it's a very inexpensive tool to use, and I highly recommend it if you're not sure of the validation or the validity of your list.
Yeah, we have a question here. What would you consider to be a small batch when sending emails to a purchased list? Excuse me.
Purchase list, a couple thousand is small, 1,000 maybe. Ideally, if you could mix that in with good email addresses, kind of going back to my other point about, good versus bad email addresses or good versus unknown. If you can mix unknown with good, then that, 1,000 could be 2,000, 2,500, 3,000. Typically though, if you're just emailing a cold list that you purchased, I'd start with 1,000. I'd see how the results are, and I would run it through NeverBounce. So I'd say I'd do 1,000 to the valids. I'd see what my results are. Then I would do another batch where I would take some of the unknowns and mix them with the valids and kind of work my way up. So it's not warming, right? It's not IP warming like we talked about previously. It's more about kind of like list warming in a sense. But I would mix them in if possible, and if I can't, I'd say 1,000, 2,000 tops for a purchase list. These are great questions, guys. So yeah, keep them coming. A question about A grade and B grade emails. And again, I'm just kind of peeking out the corner of my eye. So what I would typically do is mix them, because your B grade emails on their own may get you a 70% deliverability and you may get flagged. Whereas your A grade emails, you're close to 100%. So again, you're balancing the averages now. So 100% on one list, say 80% on the other. Now I have a 90% deliverability, so I'm not going to get flagged. So again, that's something that that will help if you start to average them out. So I think that's really a helpful way to approach that. So as far as segmentation, so this is really important to me. I'm a huge fan of building lots of lists. So the idea with segmentation is I don't just want a list that has everybody in it that I send to on a monthly basis. I want a list where I know who you are, what types of engagements we've had in the past, what you've been interested in the past, what channel you came through. Were you a social lead? Were you a pay-per-click lead? Were you an organic lead? So I want to understand all of that so that when I send out emails, I have my list specifically for web design, right? So I might say, okay, anybody that I think needs a new website, I've gone to their site, it's not mobile friendly, it's not optimized for SEO. I want an email just to those people to talk about their website, versus people that I've talked to about technology implementation in the past. I want to send them an email about consulting work that we can do for them. So I want to segment my audiences by the things, the data points I understand about them. It's a little harder with the MailChimps and Constant Contacts. It's easier with the HubSpots and the Pardots and the Marketos of the world. So again, the idea is that I want to get the right message at the right time in front of the right people. And that's what segmentation will allow us to do, is to deliver a very personalized experience to our audience. So you'll improve your ROI of email by sending specific messages to a highly targeted audience. And again, the reason we do that is because it's not one size fits all. And you might say, well, this email is only going to 100 people. I'd rather send a very specific message to 100 people than send a very generic message to 1,000 people, because I really can improve my response rate on those smaller lists where I know more about them and I can personalize the emails I'm sending. When we talk about the segmentation, there's static and dynamic lists. So a static list is I just upload a bunch of people to a list manually, versus dynamic lists. Essentially, you would have a list that's built based on content, or data points. So, you know, someone's state equals Rhode Island, I want them to go into a local marketing list. Whereas if their state equals, you know, California, maybe they go more into a regional list where I target the West Coast and we send it a different time, for example. So we can use data points we can use data points like last activity date with dynamic lists. So dynamic lists are great to keep fresh data and kind of make sure that we're always targeting people with the right message. So to kind of touch on that again, basically active versus inactive, right? So we have one list, and we do this all the time. We have an active list where we send everybody that we know is engaged with content in the past, that we expect a very high open rate from our active list. Our inactive list, and I'll show in a minute, we send things like, you know, are you still interested in receiving messages from us? I want to take the inactive list and make them active, and at some point clean them out of the database. And then customers versus prospects, I want to segment those two lists. So who's a customer, who's a prospect? I want to base my emails on product or service fit, what they've been interested in the past, and then based on the source that they came from originally. And I want to make sure to keep my list clean. So this is we have to ask email, do you still want to hear from us? This essentially is the type of email that we would send to people that have not engaged at all. So if they're not engaging with anything we send them over 6 months, for example, we'll send an email like this, and this email will help me clean up my database. One thing to note is that sending the people that never open actually impacts your deliverability across the board. So ESPs work just like the search engines do. If people are opening your emails, they're replying to emails, they're clicking on links, you're going to get ranked higher. So Google and Microsoft will rank you higher and place you higher in the inbox if people using those ESPs engage with your content. If you constantly send a Gmail and no one ever opens, guess where you're going to go? You're going to end up in spam. So make sure to clean out your email list. Again, people that are never opening, never clicking, never responding, it doesn't provide any value to keep sending to them. I'd rather have a smaller list of engaged people than a larger list of people that aren't as engaged. I know we're probably running a few minutes over, so I'm going to, we'll get to some of the questions. If we have time at the end, we'll address some of these questions. If we don't, though, we're going to go back to these questions and we'll answer them after anyway. So make sure to keep asking your questions and we'll make sure they all get addressed. But I'm going to turn it over to Cassie. Cassie's actually going to talk about crafting your email and go from there. So Cassie, you're up.
Thanks, Gil. I'll let you drive the slides. All right, perfect. So everything that Gil just went over is just as important as actually setting up the email. So let's take this email, for example. This was one of the promotional emails we sent for this specific webinar campaign, and I'll dissect the anatomy of this. So the first thing that your prospects or your clients will see in the inbox is the subject line. So we want to make sure that's engaging and also isn't including spam words that are going to land us in the spam filter. So we'll go over that in a bit. The other thing is, who is this email from? So who is it from? Are you sending from an info@ email address, or are you sending from an actual person? We recommend sending when possible, and also including your domain. So here you can see me pointing to the domain email. address, we're sending from Grow with IMG, not a generic domain address. In addition, we have images, messaging, and our call to action. So this is all the content within the email once it's opened up. So I'll start with imagery here. We want to make sure that our images are compressed and sized properly for our ESP, and then we're also including alternative text behind our images. And again, I'll touch on that in just a moment. And then our messaging. Does it have a clear intent? Is it easy to read? Can you read it on mobile? Can you read it on desktop? All of that information is really important. And again, a visual email versus a nurture campaign emails, the messaging is going to visually look different and have different content. So keep all of that in mind when you're crafting your message. Every email that you send should have some sort of call to action, whether you include a specific button here, like save your seat today, or you're having a call to action to book a meeting if you're sending a nurture campaign. Make sure that you identify that call to action before you even start writing your message. If we dive into the footer here, these are the requirements that comply with CAN-SPAM, as Gil was discussing earlier. We need to display our physical address. And then you also need to have an option for your recipients to opt out from receiving email. There's two ways you can address this. You can have a preference center, or you can have an unsubscribe link. We always recommend going with a preference center because some email services have filters that will actually scan your emails before they hit your inbox to check for malicious links and activity. So if you have an unsubscribe link here and your server like Gmail is checking all of those links for you, it will click on that link and accidentally opt you out without your recipient ever realizing that. So if you have a preference center where you open up to a page and ask people, do you still want to receive messages from us? Would you prefer to receive monthly communication? That will avoid you from accidentally opting out people. Mike, do we have any questions about the anatomy of an email? I can probably answer one quickly.
Yes, we do actually, Cassie. Is it best practice to have only one CTA?
That's a great idea. And I think it depends on the goal of your email. So in our specific case here, we're sending an email for a webinar. We're only including the one CTA to save your seat. If you're sending out a monthly newsletter, you may have several call to actions and drive people to different pages on your website or different pieces of content. So that all depends on the type of messaging that you want to get across. Okay, next we have email expectations. So you've crafted a perfect email and you're sending it out. What should you expect to see from results? And I know someone had asked earlier, what do all these metrics mean? So I do have definitions on this slide. So one thing I want to note, these are averages across all industries. So these numbers could fluctuate higher or lower depending on who you're sending to in what industry. So the average open rate we see is 18%. Anything in the 20 to 30% range is really excellent because one thing to note is that's not your true open rate. The open rate, ESPs determine open rate by an email that actually has images delivered. So if you're opening emails on a provider like Outlook and your images are shut off and not displaying, someone could actually open your email, read all the content, but your ESP is not going to count that as an actual email open. So keep that in mind. Your real open rate is probably higher than what you're actually seeing. Your average click-through rate will fluctuate again, depending on the type of message you send. So if you're sending a newsletter with a lot of call to actions, you should expect to see a high click-through rate. If we're sending a nurture campaign where we're requesting a meeting, we probably won't see a high click-through rate because we're expecting people to reply to us. And then here you have your click to open rate. So this is the number of people who have opened and clicked your email. So this will be higher than just your average click-through rate. And then I do want to touch on unsubscribe rate. So this is per email sent. We do hope to see a very low unsubscribe rate of just 0.1% there. And we have all the industry averages here. And again, we'll be sending out this presentation so you all can review as needed. One very important note is that mobile devices account for 60% of email opens. So that's over half of the emails sent. So that means all of the emails that you create must be optimized for both mobile and desktop. Most ESPs do have responsive templates in place that will allow the email to look good on both. But if not, you may need to work with a developer to create an HTML email template that's responsive for your needs.
There's some hotels about $190.
Okay. So let's talk about some tips to actually increase your email deliverability. So first things first, you're going to want to validate your DNS records through your ESP's guidelines. So your DNS records can be found in 3 places. It may be on where your domain is registered, like a GoDaddy.com.
That's the big problem, right?
Getting a little bit of feedback.
If you went tonight, like,
It may be on your website, like a Squarespace.
is, you're more worried about getting there on time tomorrow, right?
Gil, are you able to mute that user?
Yes, I'm looking.
Thank you. So yes, it may be on your website, like a Squarespace or a Wix. You can often go into the back end and validate your records that way. Or it might be through a third-party server, like something Cloudflare, something like Cloudflare. Okay, next slide, please, Gil. All right, tip number 2, know when to send your emails. So typically the optimal times to send an email are between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And the optimal days are midweek, so Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We do typically see a significant drop off on Monday and Friday, but more importantly, these are just benchmarks. So you should consider when your actual audience is online and when are they available to have downtime to review their emails. So this will vary a lot by industry. So keep that in mind when you're crafting your messages and when you're scheduling them to send. Another note, if you're doing consistent outreach with a newsletter or maybe a quarterly update, create your marketing calendar ahead of time and get those scheduled on consistent deadlines.
One thing to add too, I was busy muting, but on the previous slide about the DNS, if you have not adjusted your DNS with your email provider, it means that it hasn't been done, right? So they don't do it for you. So if you're on MailChimp, Constant Contact, usually it's more of those batch and blast providers where it's an option that you wouldn't know to look for. If you have not done it on one of those platforms, if you have not put settings on your domain specifically for sending on behalf of MailChimp or Constant Contact or so on, it's most likely not done. So I would make sure you check on that or check with your email provider because it's very important to do that.
Thanks, Gil. Okay, so tip number 3, we want to pair messaging with strong imagery. So there's a few things to keep in mind when it comes to images in email. So there's an ideal ratio when you're creating a visual email template. So that's 80-20. We want to have 80% text and 20% imagery. The reason we don't want to use, 99% images in an email is because that will automatically land you in the spam filter. So you want to avoid that. When you're actually picking your images to use in your emails, you want to make sure you're compressing them before you pull them into your ESP. If you take a very large image file and then drag it into your ESP and resize it within there, that file is still going to be large and could likely end your email in the spam filter once again, because the file is just too big to deliver. Again, you're pulling these images into your ESP and you want to make sure that they're hosted within there. And then another important note here is you want to add alternative text to all of your images. So your ESP will have a section to do this. And the benefit of having alt text is, again, if you're using Outlook and you have images off, rather than just having a blank square, it will actually display the text that should be where that image is. That will also work to use to provide accessibility for people who use screen readers. So we recommend adding this. It's an extra step that does not take much time at all. All right. Okay, tip number 4. So this is crafting your subject line with care. So briefly, we talked about some words that we want to avoid in our subject line. So I'll just review those quickly. So the word free, I'm sure we've all seen this or other money topics. There's a whole list of words that involve money topics that have just been included to land us in spam immediately. Again, emojis and symbols can also do the same thing. I do believe there's a time and a place for emojis, but if your subject line is half text, half emojis, that will likely trigger spam. Using words like guaranteed can quickly, have our users faced with a bit of skepticism. So we don't want to include words like that will have our readers thinking that this email isn't legitimate. And then overuse scarcity tactics like limited time or other, one spot left, things like that will not get open and they could end you in spam. So let's talk about some of the things we do want to include. Questions. So some of you might have received the email from Gil. Did you get my last email? Questions will automatically trigger a response in someone's head, whether they're actually going to type it out, yes or no, did I receive your email? They're likely answering it in their head immediately, so they will likely open the email. Other things we can include are A/B testing. So most ESPs do provide native A/B testing. And just to review what A/B testing is, you're testing two elements against each other to decide if they get a higher open rate or a higher click-through rate. And you'll decide that when you're setting up your test. So you're picking a portion of your list, it could be somewhere up to 50%, and half of them are getting variation A, half are getting variation B. That goes out, and then the winner of that section gets the remainder of the list. Other things we want to include here are personalization in our subject lines. Can we include first name? Can we include company name? Most ESPs do provide that data. And if you do not have data in your list, you can provide fallbacks for that, like your company or hey there instead of hey first name. Another really cool thing is preview text. And Gil, if you could give me a tap there, thank you. So this is the text that displays after your actual subject line. So this is a screenshot of my inbox. You don't want to have just your subject line and then a link or text that doesn't make sense. This will actually kind of continue the email and prompt people to open it.
Cassie, we have a quick question regarding
Yeah.
A/B testing.
Yep.
What is the minimum number of emails to A/B test? If you only send to 200 people at a time, is A/B testing worth it, or should we just test from email to email?
That's a great question. You could technically do it at a list size like that, but I would probably set up manual testing at that point and either just split the list yourself or test in multiple sends. But I would say 1,000 people is typically a great test to go with. All right, and then I just want to review a brief email sending checklist. So before sending out any email, you will want to send yourself a test email as well as your team, so you can have multiple sets of eyes on it. And one thing we do want to note is that some emails that you send as a test may end up in your spam folder, but don't be alarmed. That's likely not going to be the case for the rest of the emails you send. That's just because you're sending from yourself to yourself. Things you want to briefly review while you're sending yourself a test email. Again, preview on email and desktop because we know 60% of our emails are opened on on mobile. We're testing all links and buttons, proofreading your copy, and reviewing the readability of your subject line and your preview text. And again, we are sending a full checklist after this webinar is complete. Any other questions, Mike?
No questions at this time, Cassie. Thank you.
All right, perfect. And I will pass it back to Gil with email technology.
Awesome. Thanks, Cass. And I know we're coming up on time, probably about 10 minutes left for those of you that can stay on. In this segment, we're going to talk about email providers, what to look for in an email service provider, and a couple of bonus tips on some other technology we use to really help for email marketing. So if you are able to stay on, some really great tips coming up in the next few minutes. If not, we're going to send the recording out after anyway. So you definitely won't miss it. So first thing is, how do we choose an email provider? So we really want to understand their reputation. This is super important. We know MailChimp, we know Constant Contact, we know HubSpot and Salesforce, and a lot of us have heard of ActiveCampaign, Campaign Monitor. And then, Joe's email builder pops up and it's $10 a month for 10,000 people. And we say, oh, that's affordable. I want to use Joe's email builder. Well, the challenge is that their IP address is not nearly as superior as MailChimp's or Constant Contacts or some of the other top tier providers. So I like to rank, my top tier providers, which we'll talk a little bit about, as really where I want to spend my money. They're usually cost around the same. But again, you will find some lower cost providers, but their IP reputation, their deliverability will not be the same. So you run the risk of the emails not getting through. You also run the risk of getting blacklisted because you're on an IP address that's not clean. So you want to be careful about making your decisions solely based on cost. You also want to look at their design capabilities. How's their email builder? Is it going to be easy for you to replicate the emails on a monthly basis or a consistent basis? So you want to look at the email builder. And then you also want to see what other features they offer. So do you need the ability to make surveys or forms or automation. Do you need to integrate with your CRM? These are all other features that some providers have and others don't. So sometimes you might find a great top tier email provider that just does email, and that's all you need them for. So you might pay a little less than, Constant Contact has really gotten into the space of offering a little bit more, but a lot of people may not use those services. So they might be paying more for things they don't need. So look at the additional features, as you're starting to address what provider you should be looking at, but typically stay with the household names. You really want to make sure that you are using the solution that that you've heard of or that people are really reviewing and other people are using. What that leads us to is kind of the landscape. So there's a question about, creating nurture emails in the chat now. There's 3 different types of email platforms. They are not the same. This is very important. This question comes up all the time. So first group is the traditional email marketing platforms: MailChimp, Constant Contact, Campaign Monitor, Aweber, SendGrid. Those platforms are typically used for mostly batch and blast emails, mostly just email. It's not as much about web integration or CRM integration. Those are tools that your everyday business will use to send out their newsletters and promotional emails. They're great for that. They have a little bit of automation sometimes, but those are the tools you'd use if you're looking to send some periodic emails, again, monthly, a couple times a month. Less automation, less web integration, less integrations with other tools. When we go to a marketing automation platform, they can do everything an email marketing platform can do, but what they offer is much more automation, much more dynamic list creation, integration with CRM or native CRM, website tracking, form integration. You can do surveys, you can do integrate with events like the Eventbrite we had for today. So a marketing automation platform like Pardot, HubSpot, Marketo, Acton, SharpSpring, those are much more than an email marketing platform. They can do everything an email marketing platform can do, but you'd use them more for nurture campaigns, one-to-one automated emails, data-driven emails, and again, more CRM integration and web integration. That's where your marketing automation tools come in. And then the third bucket here is what they call sales engagement platforms. And again, we see this a lot. Somebody using a Reply.io or Outreach or SalesLoft, High Velocity Sales, and Yesware are 2 other common ones that we see. Those are engagement platforms. They are not email marketing platforms. They allow for small batch sending. So 100, 200, maybe 500 people. It's meant for very personal sales outreach. So your sales team would usually use a tool like Reply.io, whereas your marketing team would use a tool like Pardot or HubSpot, right? So it sends right from your inbox. It doesn't have its own DNS to validate. It actually attaches to your email, to your Google or your Microsoft account. It sends directly through that account. It does have some light automation, but they're not usually visual emails. There's usually not a very visual email builder. They're meant for sales outreach specifically. So it is common to see a combination of an Outreach or Reply.io with a Pardot and HubSpot. It is not common to see someone use MailChimp with Pardot or HubSpot. So usually marketing automation platforms can do most of what you'd need. And in some cases, you'd add on a sales engagement tool on top of that if you want your sales team to have that ability.
We have a couple questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. First question. I was thinking of switching from HubSpot to ActiveCampaign. We will use it for customer journeys, email, and the CRM. Is this a good idea?
That might be an offline question. HubSpot's a great tool. It could, if it's a cost issue, that's something to talk about. HubSpot, in theory, is a better platform than ActiveCampaign. I look at HubSpot, Pardot, Marketo as kind of like your top tier. ActiveCampaign is okay. Acton is okay. And again, there's a lot to get into there, but I would weigh those options. And if it's a cost option, you could talk to HubSpot, and if they know you're moving, they'd probably do something from a cost perspective.
Okay, and one more quick question here. Can you use multiple types of ESPs at the same time?
You can. I don't know. I'm not sure there'd be a tremendous value there, but you can. You would validate all of them with your DNS. So you could have multiple DNS entries for multiple email platforms. The goal would be to consolidate. That would be my preference. But if there's a reason to have multiple, then it is possible. Yep. right, so marketing versus sales, yes, that's where Reply.io, Outreach.io in combination with an email platform would be a good mix. But those other tools, Reply.io and Outreach, will attach to your inbox, so you won't even need to adjust DNS settings for those. But that's actually a very common combination. All right, and a couple of tools I just want to mention that we use. So 3 tools that I really like, email related. They have free or lightly paid versions. There's one called Hunter.io. If you're looking for email addresses at a specific company or at a domain, you can type in the domain name. In this case, I typed in ours, or you can type in the company name, and it actually searches the internet for email addresses. It tells you if they're verified. It tells you the pattern, right? So is it always first name at domain? Is it first initial, last name at domain? And then it tells you the sources where it found those email addresses. So the free version, I forget the number. I think it allows you to do like 25 to 50 searches. But if you're looking for people at a specific company, this is a great tool to find email addresses and actually download them. With the paid version, which I think starts at like $50 a month, you can actually import an entire list of domain names or a list of company names, and it will return a list of email addresses that it's found at those companies. So this is a good way to build your own list if you specifically know what companies or websites that you're looking for emails from. So I like it. I think it's worth checking out. And again, they have a free version to kind of test it out to see if it would be helpful. The next one, this is a free tool. Love this tool. It's called Mail Tester. The domain is here. You can try it out after. There'll be a link that we'll send out. It gives you an email address to send your email to. And when you do, it actually does a review of that email. So before you send the email to your audience, you can send it to Mail Tester, and they'll actually let you know if there's any spam concerns. They want to make sure you're authenticated, your DNS is validated. They want to make sure the code is well formatted, that you're not blacklisted, and that there's no broken links. And then it gives you a score. So you could do this for every email you send out. You could send it to Mail Tester first, make sure it doesn't see any issues, and then adjust or send based on what you get back. So this is a 100% free service. So again, I like it not just because it's free, but a lot of value for this free service here, and it's mail-tester.com.
Yo, quick question here.
Yep.
Is Mail Tester more robust than the built-in tool in Pardot?
Yeah, I mean, so Pardot actually uses that tool when they're testing deliverability for their clients. So, but it is more robust than what you find natively in any email marketing platform that I've seen. Yep. So it's, yeah, good questions, Ev. But yeah, it's I always test email. Once you get the hang of what makes a good email, you don't have to do it all the time. But as kind of best practice as a starting point, it is good to use a tool like that. And then the third one, actually, some email marketing platforms have this built in. Pardot has it built in a certain version. I'm not sure if HubSpot has Litmus built in, but Litmus tests your email on every platform imaginable. So how does it look in Gmail? How does it look in the app? How does it look in Outlook, on the iPhone, in Yahoo or AOL Mail? So litmus.com allows you to send your email and preview it to make sure it looks good on every possible device. Now, Litmus is not free, so this isn't really a great solution if you're sending small volume of emails, because it's probably cost prohibitive, but it starts at like $100 a month. But if you're a high volume email sender and email is a big part of your marketing, spending $1,200 a year on making sure that your emails are always fully optimized might be worth it. It also does some of the things that the Mail Tester does. There's some accessibility and link flagging as well. So really great tool. Again, Pardot, certain versions have it built in. I'm not sure if HubSpot has it built in, but it is a really powerful tool if you're willing to spend some money on it. So definitely one of the tools I really like as well. One question about the coffee carts had come up. We're going to send those out after. So I know a couple people had asked about that. So that is, we'll address that in an email after. So we'll make sure everybody gets their coffee, because I have mine. I wouldn't have made it through without. So. All right. Last slide has a lot of words on it. I don't know if I necessarily need to read them all. I know we're a couple minutes over here, but basically, just to kind of recap, we talked about anti-spam and making sure that we're collecting data in a thoughtful and meaningful way. We want to make sure that we're not just knowingly spamming people. Yes, there's a gray area. It is okay to buy lists. It just matters how we approach that list sending and where we get the list from. Question came up about list sources. Zoom Info is good. Info USA is good. Discover.org is good. There's a lot of other ones as well, but just know your list your list source, and make sure you're sending emails that that you're not misleading people when you're sending them. Maintain clean data, super important. I'd rather have a much smaller database with clean data and active prospects than a larger database where I don't know who's in there and it's just a, kind of a free for all. So segment and keep your data clean and continue to clean. Always look to clean up your data. Leverage those third-party tools when you can. So NeverBounce and some of the other tools we mentioned, use those before you send. Make sure you're sending to a good list before you actually send it. Make sure you review domain reputation. You want to look for blacklists occasionally. Again, you don't have to do it all the time, but make sure that you do occasionally look, and make sure your DNS is validated. Again, if you haven't actually gone and added your domain or updated your domain yourself for the email platform you're on, you want to make sure it's done, and most likely it's not if you haven't done that. Make sure you're setting realistic goals and expectations. You're expecting 100% open rate, 80% open rate, not realistic, right? Expecting a 20% open rate is realistic, and then getting 30% and you feel good about that, knowing that more people actually open the email. That's just the number that the reports can show. Do a lot of testing, test your subject lines, test your calls to action, make sure you're focused on spam and response rates. Make sure you have your image to text ratios. I've seen people just drop a huge image in their emails and send it out. Definitely not best practice, and absolutely can end up in spam, or most likely will. Combine visual and natural looking emails. Don't always just send those batch and blast emails. Work on sending maybe a follow-up email that says, hey, wanted to make sure you got our newsletter last week. Let us know if you have any questions, or let us know if you want to continue to receive it, or let us know, if you found it helpful, right? Or you send an email out with some really great content, then send a personal email that goes out saying we wanted to get your feedback. So mix and match the visual emails with the natural, more one-to-one looking emails. You'll get a much higher response rate. Make sure you choose the right email service provider. Make sure they offer the right product mix and the services you need. Make sure that the price is affordable, but also make sure they're reputable. Very important. And then be consistent, right? This isn't something that you're just going to start tomorrow and all of a sudden you're going to see all the results that you want. It's going to take time, but don't start tomorrow and then not send anything for 3 months. So consistency is key with any marketing, especially email marketing. And again, the email providers will start to sense that consistency and start to give you more authority. If you go months without sending an email, you're actually less likely to get into the inbox. So you do want to make sure that you're consistent with emails to keep the deliverability. And with that, a lot of people stayed on, which is great. I really appreciate that, because I know we are a little bit over. But with that, first of all, I want to make sure to thank you. I mean, this was fantastic. We had a ton of fun putting it together. Again, I know it went a little long. That's the downside with being the guinea pigs, us kind of going through this the first time with you guys, but there was so much great information that we felt like we wanted to get across. So hopefully it was worth sticking around for an extra 15 minutes here. But there's just so much to know with email marketing, and we wanted to make sure to cover it all. Again, we will be sharing this after, but we really appreciate, we had so much fun doing this. The team really, we worked a lot together to put this together, and we all really enjoyed it. So we want to thank you for allowing us to put this together, because the response was so great. It really kind of, got us excited about wanting to do this for you guys. So just kind of in closing, we'll make sure to answer any questions that are left over in chat. We will send out an email about the gift card, the coffee gift cards, and we will follow up with the recording as well. So everybody will get a copy of the recording from today's session. You're going to get a survey within the hour, so please fill that out. We definitely want to hear from you guys. We want feedback. We want to know what we can do better next time, and really what some of those key takeaways were for you. So we'd love to hear from you after this. So you'll get that shortly. And if there's no other questions, we'll let you guys go and hopefully talk to you again soon. Mike, any last questions as people are?
No, it doesn't look like any.
Okay.
No, thank
All
you.
right. Yeah, and like I said, we'll address anything that's any questions that are open. We'll address those in an email after. So thank you guys all so much again for attending. Really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Great info. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Thanks, guys.